On November 22nd, the wrestling world said goodbye to another performer who passed on at too young of an age. Mark Bison Smith was not a household name in North America, but carved out a living in this industry, traveling the world and beating down the door of foreign promoters to take notice, and that is what they did. A product of the Northern California scene and christened into the business by Michael Modest and Donovan Morgan, Smith took his unique physical tools and parlayed them into his passion of professional wrestling, entering the business in 1998. In 2003, he would venture south to Puerto Rico for the IWA organization and then received his biggest break working for Pro Wrestling Noah in 2005, where he became a featured foreign star and comprised a tag team alongside Akitoshi Saito as well as Keith Walker. In 2009, he had his biggest exposure in North America, working for Ring of Honor.
I think Ring of Honor, they give us a lot of room to work how we want to work as wrestlers and artists, because that's what we are. In some other promotions in the United States, people are kind of restricted to what they do because they've got a TV time limit. They got to do what's by the book. But Ring of Honor is, everybody could bring out their own style.
Mark Bison Smith was 38 years old at the time of his passing, and we send our thoughts to his family and friends.
Hello everyone, I'm Kevin Gill, and it is my pleasure today to bring you this esteemed panel of wrestling luminaries from the California region. I'm joined today by Roland Alexander, the founder of All Pro Wrestling. I'm also joined by Dr. Mike Lano, photographer extraordinaire, and of course, Alan Bolte, legendary ring announcer in the territory.
Thank you, thank you. That's what we're going to be talking about among a lot of things today. The territories, wrestling old and new. I was involved, of course, as ring announcer in Northern California for Roy Shire, who certainly had one of the greatest promotions in the country, the entire Northern California area, with the Cow Palace being the big plum, as you used to always call it, every month on a Saturday night, sold out the Cow Palace. Shire started in about 63 and eventually closed the territory in about January of 82. I announced with him from about 74 through the end. And Mike, Roland, I mean, you certainly know the tremendous talent that was there. On one occasion, we had over 17 towns going. So every week, 4 or 5 nights a week was live wrestling somewhere. And it was on television, of course, which was a big thing at that time. You had to have TV, even though cable wasn't really in then yet. You had to have a strong TV station to really pack the arenas.
And Ellen, I don't want you to sell yourself short. You also did the program all of those years, the monthly program for all the towns, as well as being Roy's event in-ring announcer. You also hosted a lot of the TV shows.
Thank you.
From Sacramento.
And what tremendous memories they are.
And Roy, I'm going to go very quickly and then pitch to Roland. Roy was a master of television. Of course, we're going to name some territories here very quickly. Los Angeles, Jules Strongbow. In the Southern California area, there was a lot of competitors, Cal Eaton, but then he paired up Jules Strongbow as my home-based territory out of all I covered with Charlie Mr. Moto. They were the tag team genius bookers, as Roy was in San Francisco. But both L.A. and San Francisco made phenomenal use of TV. L.A. went back to 48. But here's just some of the, and I want Roland to catch me if I miss any. Vancouver, Kiniski, Gene Kiniski and various partners. The Maritimes, Leo Burke family. Of course, Stampede, Calgary. How can you not think of the most influential family in the Hart family and Stu Hart. Montreal had 2 promotions, Grand Prix, the Vachons, and Luta, which was the Rougeos. Winnipeg, Al Tomko. Toronto, Tunney at his Plum. Maple Leaf Gardens, of course, Tri-WF and AWA, which encompass many states. St. Louis, the Keel, Sam Munchnick. Portland, Don Owen, he and Jarrett from Memphis, who took over from Nick Goulas. Those 2 were the last ones that went on, as we'll discuss. You had Anton Ripper Leone come in sort of a little bit later on in California. Phoenix at the Phoenix Madison Square Garden. Amarillo, the Funks. San Antonio was the Blanchard family. Houston, Paul Bosch. Dallas, Fritz von Erich, etc. Mid-South, that was Leroy McGurk, later Bill Watts. Pittsburgh was actually a Tri-WF offshoot, a sort of indie, if you will, back in the 60s and 70s with Bruno Sammartino and Pedro Martinez. Pedro Martinez, of course, also ran the NWF in Cleveland, the Ohio area, with Johnny Powers, as well as Buffalo. Detroit was the Sheik, and he took on Dick the Bruiser, who came in from Indiana with his WWA. So the battle of 2 promotions in Detroit. In Atlanta, it was a battle of the NWA versus Ann Gunkel. Of course, Japan went on from the Ricky Dozan group to form IWE, which was an AWA offshoot, Inoki's New Japan, Baba's All Japan. CMLL, the oldest promotion in the world, then called EMLL, with Luderoth, Honolulu, Ed Francis, Lord Tallyho, James Blears. Of course, Roland brought up the great Puerto Rican promotion of Carlos Colon. And what am I leaving out?
I'm not sure. You've listed quite a few. At one time, I was told there was 28 regional promotions in the United States, Hawaii, Canada, and Puerto Rico. And to me, even though we have a national product now, I think that's where some of the mistakes of where wrestling disappeared. And it's even disappearing even quicker now with WWE's latest mention that they don't want the word wrestling or wrestle. And I think the way to expand nationally would have been to keep all the regional promotions, you know, and I think Vince could have easily headed the national program, kept all the regionals in their place, kept all the regional television in their place, make every territory open up a training school to make sure that you develop good young product. The NBA does it, the NFL does it, the Major League Baseball does it. Why can't pro wrestling have the same type of talent development system? Their wrestling has been weak for a while now because of the fact that they don't have a talent development system. And they could have that system and still do national. And now if you got a Triple H working, like let's say for Don Owens in Portland, and he's coming in and he's doing Raw 3-4 times a year, and he's doing SmackDown 3-4 times a year, well, he no longer is considered stale. And now you kind of get fired up to see Triple H because he hasn't been on in about 10, 12 weeks, you know. He's coming to SmackDown, you know. And I just think that would have been a much better way to run a national promotion. I really miss the regionals. I don't think they'll ever come back. And there was a lot of amazing things about the regionals. You know, the first thing that I think about is the fact that the ticket prices, you know, like I was talking to Alan earlier today, and he's got a couple posters. One was $3, $2. One was $4, $3.
Yeah, back in about 76, 77.
Oh.
Yeah.
And the other amazing thing was how they could run the territory, with the exception of the 1-2 major cities in the territory, basically on 10 wrestlers, you know. I know in this territory it was always 10. Sacramento was an exception. They had 14. And I believe the Cow Palace used anywhere between 14 and 18. But all the other promotions, 10 wrestlers, 1 ref, no music. Shows started at 8:30. You know, you see indie wrestling today starting at 7 o'clock, and
sometimes go until 2.
And one of the most amazing statistics I can throw out at you, like San Jose before they were one of the largest growing cities in the United States, was just a normal house show for Shires, and they did it every other week. So the fact that you're doing a show every other week, where today indies, they couldn't do every other month, let alone every other week. And they were drawn somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 2,500 fans every other week at the San Jose Civic Auditorium. That's an amazing statistic when you consider that a successful indie might get 500. 3 Even when you get 350, that's deemed good in the indie world. You know?
Absolutely, that's a smashing success these days.
And even then, in those days, Roland, you remember, it would alternate. Every Wednesday would be Sacramento, next Wednesday San Jose, every Tuesday might be Stockton, next week Salinas, and you're right about the numbers. At Richmond Auditorium, Santa Rosa, Stockton, always at least 1,500, 2,000 every show, every night. And Cow Palace, 12,000 up.
And the fans weren't spoiled to the point where they needed fancy production with music and video and pyrotechnics. Why? Because they had good wrestlers. They had good wrestling. They were very satisfied in just getting a good wrestling product, where today the wrestling product is so bad that Vince McMahon has no choice but to up the production card, with video and audio and pyrotechnics, and that's more important, really, than the wrestling inside the square circle.
Two things I want to touch on, and one of these is a topic for Kevin, in that, for example, the Amarillo territory, they sometimes could get away, Dory Funk Sr., when he promoted it, with less than 10 wrestlers. He might have an opening tag and then have two of the guys break that into two singles matches and then have like a six-man, but he's only used X amount of wrestlers. And another thing, Bruno Sammartino called these things clubs. So he would even call Madison Square Garden, Boston Garden, Philly Spectrum, Cap Center, and DC clubs, but always sold out. And another big thing was, too, is you would have continuation of feuds, and probably no better example of that in my home-based territory, although I shot all of them and flew around. In L.A., we could have Blassie and Tolis on top for almost 2 years straight, and even more so later on with Chavo and Piper starting in '76. They would change the steps and this and that, hair versus hair and whatnot, but the wrestling was so good and so unique. And of course, we didn't have the internet, and people didn't know if they went to a smaller spot show in Bakersfield or El Monte or San Bernardino, the results, and maybe the match went the same as the Olympic Auditorium. But it was a smaller match, better, and you could continue feuds and have rematches. Bruno always had, depending on how it went, he would meet the same guy, and then the blow-off the third match at, say, Madison Square Garden. Before they would put that match on the spot shows, would be a cage match or, whatever, Texas Death.
The big difference and reason for that, Mike, was the fact that we had bookers. And today we don't have bookers. We have writers. We have writers who don't know a thing about pro wrestling, as opposed to bookers who wrestled for 20, 25 years and were part of the business and understood wrestling.
Don't you agree? That is why a genius, and I'm going to pitch to Alan, a genius like Pat Patterson, who, of course, came from our neck of the woods, San Francisco, who carried that through, and mostly he channeled Roy Shire and the genius. He took the Battle Royal concept, made that the Royal Rumble and everything, but he also worked for Eddie Graham and Vern Gagne. So he took from those guys, and when Vince started in '84, as his quote-unquote writers, he had wrestling people who grew up with it, who had the passion. Now when you look at the trades and they're advertising for a job as a WWE TV writer, etc., no experience needed. You don't have to. They want to brainwash you. So they actually look for people who did not grow up as wrestling fans, and that's the problem. And when you see, say, one of their divas, or what have you, and if they're just a spokesmodel or a fitness model, and they didn't grow up loving the business, that's the problem. That is the problem. You don't see that sort of passion, and that's why they all sort of start blending into each other. Versus the territories, you really had to bust your ass even to get trained at the few places you could be trained at. Now luckily we've got an APW school.
Well, granted, the bookers had a huge advantage over writers. Number one, they knew the wrestlers that were working for them in the territory. And that's really important because they had their confidence. We didn't have the egos that we have today where, the agents in the locker room, they're basically professional babysitters because in the regional days, they were confident and they didn't, do you think opening bout Manuel Cruz would care whether he's going over or not? And no, because Stevens is on top tonight. And the payoffs are going to be huge because it's going to be a big house. Today, you got guys crying because, I can't lose on TV. Come on, and so the agents they're not anything except professional babysitters.
Are you or your son or daughter celebrating a birthday soon? There's no better way to celebrate a birthday than to throw the birthday person a pro wrestling-themed birthday party. We have several packages available, including renting our facility with a customized pro wrestling show. Bring your birthday cake and invite your guests to attend a private pro wrestling birthday party. If you are interested in having All Pro Wrestling be a part of your birthday celebration, give us a call at 510-785-8396 or visit the website at www.allprowrestling.com.
What is referred to as parity booking, where if you get a win this time, then you have to lose to the same person next week, and therefore by it always everyone trading a win back and forth, no one ever can get over because no one can get any momentum behind them. Mike, on your point about not only is it encouraged for people to have no experience, it's just if you are familiar with the professional wrestling product, you are much less likely to get a job in WWE. And several of the former writers who have left and created this I Want Wrestling podcast and website and have now been revealing to the public kind of the internal process and procedures, several of those guys lied about their interest in professional wrestling, saying that they had none in order to get the job. And the one other point I wanted to make, talking about these writers coming in and scripting everything, that era more or less started around 2001 or so, where everyone is being given a scripted line. And if you look at the timeline, it's 2011 as we sit here today. The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin are the last two guys that were able to emerge through their own charisma, their own connection with the audience, their own creativity and ability to cut a promo, connect, and talk people into the seats. Part of the reason that no one is close to stepping up to that level is no one has the opportunity to speak, to connect, and further, that was a hallmark of the territory days because, like you said, you would be in all these different territories all the time. You're learning different styles. You're learning how to get over in different places. And now, like we said, it's not even wrestling somehow at the top of the pile.
Well, there's no more interviews. You can't call an interview when there's not someone holding the microphone. If you got the wrestler holding the microphone, that is not an interview.
Correct. Yeah. We used to televise in this territory, Channel 40 in Sacramento. That was the main. Every Monday night, we televised a 1-hour live show at the studio there that held about 120 people. And then after the event, there were always 3 satellites. They would do live interviews for San Francisco Cal Palace event, which would be that Saturday night, for Sacramento's show, which would be that next Wednesday night, and for Fresno, which would be the Saturday after that. So all the smaller cities would revolve around this TV show, which would be shown in all over San Francisco, Sacramento, the entire Northern California area. And that was real important. And you also had a change of talent, as we call it, a change of wrestlers from time to time. For example, they'd bring in Don Morocco for a while, Moondog Mayne. Morocco might live here for at least a year, maybe 2 years, in main events, tag events. He would work the big cities, some of the smaller cities. There was a constant change.
There was no set time, Alan. There was like 6 months, a year, or 18 months, depending on how stale you might have gone during that period.
Yeah, and it was so, in those days, major change didn't occur too much in as you say, the booker. For a Pat Patterson to go from a good guy to a bad guy, from a babyface to a heel or vice versa, that was a huge thing, and that occurred. They didn't make constant changes, like today. I mean,
there was a slow, drawn-out process. So that brings us to one of Kevin's topics, the good and bad of the territories. And going back to a point Roland brought up about promos, if you couldn't talk, and that was a big prereq, but if you couldn't talk, then you had the art of a manager, and it was perfect, and that was someone simply skilled and adept at talking and getting you over selling the card. And that's lacking now, and the problem
They don't exist now.
Well, you see the territory guys like a Terry Funk, and he said this, or even Jerry Briscoe with them last week. He goes up there for the Hall of Fame thing, and they say, what would you like for us to write to you? Write for you to read in accepting your Hall of Fame thing. And he looked at them like they were crazy. He goes, I'm Terry Funk. I don't need that. So, that's what you had. You had guys who classically could speak, and really Rock Austin, Mick Foley, that was about it. And now these guys are either telepromptering or they're, memorizing rote script so it sounds, the same manner of speaking. And you have that because you're actively recruiting soap opera writers instead of true great wrestling people, a Rene Goulet or a Terry Garvin or Pat Patterson or whoever, a John Tolis or Fred Blassie. These are guys and that was the plus of the territory. They could speak. they could improvise. Nobody could improvise like a John Tolis or a Ray Stevens or a Pat Patterson or an Ole Anderson or Paul DeMarco. I mean, each territory had superstars, and almost all of them had guys like a Dick the Bruiser who would live there. You know, it was his promotion, but they would sort of homestead there, or Bill Watts in the McGurk, but also at the same time in a territory, like you mentioned Morocco, he could go to Florida, he could go to Honolulu and work. Whenever he got, I wouldn't say stale, but when your time is up in one place and the promoter says goodbye, here's the next place for you to go. As Roland said, there were 28 or 32 places to go. The territories were wonderful, and as I toured them, the only place I didn't shoot in the 70s was Calgary. They all had their own unique flavor, TV, even their photographer, their ring announcer. Everything was unique. Everything was so special, Roland. Wouldn't you and Alan agree?
Exactly. And here's another example of the way it was then. For example, Rocky Soulman Johnson, The Rock's father, tremendous talent, was here well over 3 years of great success. Then eventually, as we say, his time's maybe it's up a little bit. Still a great talent, but been here long enough. Then he'll go off to Florida. I know he worked Florida for a long time.
Why do you think he lasted? Because he did. He lasted about 3 years, which was not a normal time. What reason do you think that was? Do you think his colorfulness and the fact that he was so over with the wrestling fans kept them here, and that Roy actually thought he was drawn? Or
yeah, I think every wrestler had their unique style, something about them, the way they looked, the way they act. Were they good guy, bad guy? How do they look? How they wrestle? Were they more? Did they form a tag team of two great guys together? I remember them saying, "You won't believe it next week, fans. Tag team Rocky Johnson and Pat Patterson."
The
together.
Great part about tag team wrestling in the regionals, today you have tag teams that are specialty tag teams. Back then, the excitement was pairing a Rocky Johnson with a Ray Stevens.
Two big names.
They've never teamed up. They're two great singles wrestlers. What kind of tag team are they going to be now? And that was exciting, Touching on what Mike Lano was talking about earlier, a lot of wrestling fans who were misguided and were smartened up to the wrestling business through the internet have no clue. When they say stuff like The Shoot came about because of the internet in the late 90s and after the year 2000, that's so incorrect. In the regional days, The Shoot existed. Promoters and bookers told the wrestlers a lot of times to go out there and put a little shoot in your interview. And as let's say you got Terry Funk wrestling Ray Stevens, and Ray Stevens said something that doesn't quite agree with Terry Funk, and it's kind of a shoot. And Terry's in the back locker room, and he's thinking, oh my God, that was a shoot. He can't wait to go do his interview now. Terry Funk goes, and he says something, shoot, and that was what the promoters and the bookers wanted, because all of a sudden now you had realism created just through interviews. And that's why the interviews, to me, are so important, but they did away with them.
But the interview, sort of the best angles, the best interviews have that shoot element. And that was always true. Not an 80s, 90s
It was being done in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit, guys, about the history of the territories. We're talking high level stuff here, but now as we dive in, Mike, you mentioned the original territory. The oldest one dates back to the EMLL,
1932, Mexico, which is just tremendous. Oldest TV show continuously, oldest promotion. They're going very strong, and of course begat other promotions like UWA and AAA there.
And for me, growing up, avid reader of the wrestling magazines and stuff in the pre-cable era. Was how I kept in touch with the different territories, who was where and what's what. For me, I think it was 1985 when cable came to my town in Queens, New York, and suddenly I found out, wow, so that's where the Samoans went. They're in Polynesian Pro, and suddenly there was this whole world of wrestling. I mean,
a lot of that writing, was a big part, an important part of the booking, and I'm sure Alan Bolte can attest for this, because Alan used to write for a couple of the wrestling magazines. Alan knew what was going on in the territory. He was smart to the business, understood the storylines, the angles, everything, and he would convey those in his articles. How many magazines did you write for, Alan?
Off and on, about 7 different ones. Dr. Lano, of course, did a lot of photos for all those, too. And at one time, Roland, just the success of the pro wrestling magazines, when the territories were around, there were 12 national wrestling magazines.
Wow.
Each month, 12.
Wow.
And Wrestling World, one of the originals, Wrestling Review, started in 1959.
And what exists today?
There's only that magazine, the Stanley Weston, and now it's a paltry shell of itself, and WWE's in-house. That is it in this country. Yeah. The magazine business.
Inside Wrestling and Pro Wrestling Illustrated, I believe, into one double-facing magazine with a $10
But that's
price
how
tag.
wrestling fans educated themselves on other wrestlers. And so, like, you're reading about the Sheik, and you're reading about Dory Funk and Jack Briscoe, and now promoter Roy Shires is bringing in Jack Briscoe.
Exactly.
And you go, oh, my God, this is going to be so great. I've never seen Jack Briscoe wrestle because the regional TV didn't get to you.
Sure.
So the things that got to you were those magazine articles from their promotion, and that was what made everybody a name. And so when Jack Briscoe comes in, you're darn right I'm going to buy a ticket. I'm going to be there.
And the one thing about the magazines, Al and I writing and whatnot for them, is we were wise enough to keep it kayfabe. And the Stanley Weston magazines kind of went beyond that into making tabloid stuff and creating their own angles, which was not in accordance with what the promoter had in mind. But
and Mike, talking about kayfabe, that was such an important thing in every big promotion.
I used to hear that if the promoter knew that the one of the boys broke it, and smartened somebody up, they would break that guy's arm and throw him in a river, and that was the worst thing. The best thing would he'd be fired.
It was just such a huge thing about kayfabe, and it worked. I mean, it was.
But it was a win-win, which of course I think is one of the reasons the business has been in the crapper for a long time now. Kevin, one thing quickly. You were blessed in the Northeast. Maybe not. You were probably too young, but they actually got Florida and L.A. TV on the Spanish stations in New York and Boston. So you would see our Wednesday Los Angeles Lucha Libre 90-minute TV, and you would see the Florida. And then since McMahon worked with everyone, and I think around '76, you actually joined or rejoined the NWA in Munchnick and went to the NWA Vegas.
A wrestling fan, Mike, watches every wrestling he can get his hands on.
Exactly.
When I grew up, with wrestling, I watched the promotion from your territory. I watched the LaBelles, and I liked it, and it was really important to watch because it educated me to the boys, and so and Roy used to use a lot of them off and on. Right. They'd do like talent exchanges, and so to me that was a good thing. Even wrestling from Mexico. There would be something on that I was so against, but I'd still watch it. Like, because they got Dr. Frankenstein, and come on now, Dr. Frankenstein. But I'd watch it, because wrestling fans.
But it was different and it was special. And the other thing, too, we had, but this is probably the topic for another whole show, is the fan club newsletters, which was the predecessor to the Sheets.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And as I was saying, that was probably the first place. We didn't really mean to break kayfabe, but we'd write about, my home base territory, the top babyface. Ray Stevens was Fred Blassie, and then we'd see him. He would leave, and he'd be working at the same time simultaneously as the top heel against Pedro Morales, 73 Tri-WF in the Northeast.
Do you have what it takes to become a pro wrestler? The APW Boot Camp Training School is accepting applicants for pro wrestlers, managers, valets, and referees. All Pro Wrestling home APW Boot Camp is where future legends are born. For the last 19 years, APW has been the leader in talent development. Top graduates include the Great Khali, Crash Holly, Spike Dudley, and Alyssa Flash. For your free brochure, call us at 510-785-8396.
Right now, a lot of people think that indie wrestling is just something that started recently when the regionals went away, and that is so far from the truth. My first exposure to wrestling outside of California was by a historian by the name of Tom Burke, who was, I believe, a lifetime member of Cauliflower Alley Club, and great historian, and he had a newsletter, and it came from Arizona, and it covered Arizona, the indie promotion. Yes, there were indie promotions in the 70s. And let me tell you the difference.
They were called outlaw promotions. There was one in Chicago, too.
Kind of. Some were considered outlaws. Some, they let them slide and let them do their thing. But, like, for example, a wrestler that wrestled here from a famous tag team called the Von Steigers, Kurt and Carl Von Steiger. Carl Von Steiger ran a promotion in Arizona. The reason it was called an indie promotion was because it was not affiliated with the NWA. Back then you had WWF, which Vince's dad ran, and that covered a lot of major league cities throughout the Northeast. Then you had AWA, which Vern Gagne ran, and that covered a lot of your Midwestern stuff. Every now and then you have a WWA pop up, and they made their own, like,
and at one time that was even more powerful. The reason for it, they put the title on Ricky Dozan. So the Honolulu office, Japan office of Ricky Dozan, Japan Pro Wrestling, and then L.A., and I think they even defended on a couple of results I have in the 60s, the WWA tag and singles were defended in for Shire on Northern California towns.
And going back to Kurt von Steiger's promotion, indie promotion in Arizona, he had not one television, he had two televisions. He had North and South. And they drew a little bit smaller crowds. They weren't part of the NWA, so they called them indie wrestling. And so indie wrestling existed for those that think it did not exist in the 60s and 70s.
What are some of the subtleties for today's fan? As Mike said, what were the differences really between outlaws and indies? Were outlaws just happening within an established territory, and indies would be more on the periphery?
Exactly. Arizona, there was nobody running Arizona. Kurt von Steiger was not considered an outlaw. But you open up a promotion in a territory which, back then there wasn't any such thing as, but it was run like the mob. You know what I mean? Roy Shire's, this is Northern California, and this is his territory. Right. And if you come in, then you're an outlaw. If you come into his territory. You go somewhere like Arizona where there's no promotion, you start an indie promotion, you're not an outlaw promotion.
But that brings us to like 77, 78, the Paphos ICW, which was unique in that Roy was still going, fairly strong. He was using the Kansas City and later Florida.
Indie National Outlaw is what they
But what they did was, no one had ever done this before. They cut unique promos trashing whichever city they hoped to tour in. They never did tour, but they ran one for LA TV trashing Tolis Blassie, Guerrero Piper. The one here, as you will all remember, they trashed Roy, Pat, and Ray and said, when we come in, you people will finally see real wrestling, the Paphos and Ronnie Garvin and Crusher Broomfield, who later became One Man Gang. That was so bizarre, I didn't understand what the purpose, and that was a definite outlaw, and they had to eat crow when both Randy and Lanny Poffo then went,
and
the tail between their legs back to Jarrett.
Did the same thing, but the opposite. Vince McMahon started going to every regional territory, and he, like Don Owens, like, hey, Don, what do you think about Jimmy Snuka getting some national exposure? You like that? Oh, yeah, And so Don Owens would send footage. Vince was airing it on his TV because Vince knew that he had a game plan. And that game plan a year or two from now was to grow to a national promotion. And guess what? Now you got Jimmy Snuka, who's television marketed. And everybody knows who he is now.
5, 4.
If you would like to get involved behind the scenes with pro wrestling, we are looking for you. All Pro Wrestling is always on the lookout for talented interns in the areas of television production, including commentators, graphic design, and website design. We also have highly paid commission sales and marketing openings. For more information, email your qualifications and resume and tell us which area behind the scenes you'd love to be involved in. info@allprowrestling.com. Give us a call as well at 510-785-8396 or visit the website at www.allprowrestling.com.
Another interesting point about the Paphos and their outlaw promotion was the almost shoot-style challenges where they would be on television challenging the recognized champions and things of that nature. There were several parking lot confrontations and things in that era, and of course that was the era where carrying a gun seemed just as standard as having your...
A lot of the boys carried a gun to help them with the fans, let alone other outlaw promoters.
And a lot of fans took that so seriously. I mean, a heel, a hated wrestler, Kenji Shibuya, when Patterson was a real heel, they had to watch their private lives just 100%.
I watched Paul DeMarco and Lars Anderson run 6 to 8 blocks because they didn't park in the parking lot. And they were running these with their bags in their hand with about 40 Samoan kids with chains chasing them. Yeah. That's why you carry a gun if you're Paul DeMarco.
It was very serious and very exciting, too.
But what about Offensika's kids? I think a young Sam Fatu and Rikishi said they actually threw stuff at Mr. Fuji when he was here in, 75,
sure,
and trashed him. One thing before I forget that's unusual, or that, Roland touched on this, Vince Jr. was planning ahead of time. He bought out my boss, Mike LaBelle, December of '82. He promised he could be the local promoter. that was, well before putting the title on Hogan and starting to steal guys from the territories we had left. He had that battle plan, so he bought the L.A. territory, and Mike LaBelle was always close and sort of like at times VP guy to Mike LaBelle from the mid '70s when he left the NWA recognition.
Kevin, you seem to be knowledgeable about the national promotion that what was his name, Fernandez ran with the Northeast with Mil Mascaras and stuff.
Oh, Eddie Einhorn, the IWA. We haven't even brought the IWA.
Now, that was an outlaw national promotion. What did they do back then to combat that? I know in the regional days, if you come in and run during Shires, he'd call every NWA promoter and get one or two of their top guys. And you got to remember now, these are promoters like you call Pat O'Connor. Pat O'Connor hated Roy Shires. Roy Shires hated Pat O'Connor. But they stuck together as far as the NWA was concerned. And if there's an outlaw trying to put Roy out of business, Pat O'Connor will help Roy. What was done with the national?
It's hard to say. I mean, from my personal perspective, I got to see some unusual to me events. Like it was, I believe the year was 1985, and in Queens, New York, I saw a show that was headlined by Abdullah the Butcher versus the Boogie Woogie Man, Jimmy Valiant.
That was Pro Wrestling America. That was Eddie Einhorn's second. The first one was started early in '74. Ann Gunkel, who was running an outlaw group in Atlanta and actually beating house show attendance against the more established Atlanta Paul Jones, the promoter, not the wrestler, NWA office. And Ann Gunkel's promotion, as it sort of petered out after Ray Gunkel's death, which was why she formed it, her lead bookers, basically Dickie Steinborn, got in touch with Eddie Einhorn, who would be the future owner, a billionaire at the time of the Chicago White Sox. And so here you had a good money mark, a good-hearted guy. And that was how the IWA had slowly formed in Atlanta. It moved to South Carolina, and then I joined it and actually was their touring photographer with Napolitano and the others in New Jersey because they wanted to take on. So that IWA group, a sort of national, Eddie Einhorn had enough money, he could buy TV in all major markets. It was on everywhere on Saturday nights typically, and it was on better channels. So here's the rub. And he was running against both the NWA and Vince Sr. Bruno always tells me when they ran that Vince Sr. would call him up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat worrying because Vince McMahon's TV, the Tri-WF, powerful TV, was on a crummy UHF channel 38 or 48, and Eddie Einhorn was able to buy WOR like Channel 9, a high prestige, in more markets, stronger channel. And Bruno said, relax, the IWA is going to fail, and you know why? Because Pedro Martinez is booking it. And that's kind of what happened. But they had spectacular shows. They took talent from the Sheik's office in Ohio. I mean, that very first show.
The booking was the difference.
Yeah, they didn't have any booking. They threw stuff together on the fly. I mean, Al Costello and George Cann were trying to help Pedro Martinez book it. I actually watched, writing stuff down. But the first of the three, they're big deals before they moved TV to the Beacon Theater right in New York City. The historic Beacon Theater was the Roosevelt Stadium, which just last year got flattened. Roosevelt Stadium in New Jersey, the first of the three outdoor spectaculars in pouring rain, capped by Koloff's first and last appearance, at least in the main event. He headlined against Mil Mascaras, Mil the champion. But in that dressing room, Munchnick came to look and snoop. Johnny Powers, before he wrestled, the Sheik was there, Johnny Valentine, Ricky Starr. Thez came, and he would later be hired on, and he would actually work some matches with Mascaras and Ref. It was loaded with more talent than I'd seen in a lot of places.
And is that the same promotion that wasn't one of those shows headlined by a boxer? Was it Chuck Wepner?
No, that was the Inoki Ali thing.
Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali, I believe.
And they had in
Andre
each
the Giant was each area.
Right.
In the Cow Palace, we had Patterson wrestled on that closed
But this
circuit.
was the national because Vince McMahon he actually initially had tried to do that with Inoki against Bruno, or Bruno against Ali, but then he couldn't find the funders, so Inoki's many funders for New Japan did it in concert with Vince. So the thing that was beamed included the Wepner and Andre match from Shea Stadium, and I think one other match, and then many venues, not in mine of L.A., but in San Francisco. Roy had some live wrestling, and then he had the footage on there. But back to, so that wasn't related. Einhorn, that IWA fizzled by '78. It was done, but then he came back basically because Vern Gagne teamed up with the NWA, and they had those spectacular cards in Minnesota, and then in I think upstate New York. You might have seen with Abbey. So you would get the NWA and the AWA champion. It was a dream for fans. They couldn't crack that market because, as in '75, Vince Sr. had all the cards for the major arenas. Sure. They were stuck at.
But one of the major differences between indie wrestling back then, or outlaw promotion back then, and indie wrestling today was, I don't care if they were an indie or an outlaw, nobody made a move unless they had television. Mm-hmm. And today, the indie wrestlings, they're going to continue to draw 100 to 300 people unless you have television. Even APW, who has television now, until we market that we have television to WWE fans and TNA fans, people won't know we're on television, so there's no television. But if we marketed that and we could build our television fan base, then eventually we could end up being a pretty good draw in house shows.
Are you or your son or daughter celebrating a birthday soon? There's no better way to celebrate a birthday than to throw the birthday person a pro wrestling themed birthday party. We have several packages available, including renting our facility with a customized pro wrestling show. Bring your birthday cake and invite your guests to attend a private pro wrestling birthday party. If you are interested in having all pro wrestling be a part of your birthday celebration, give us a call at 510-785-8396 or visit the website at www.allprowrestling.com.
We've talked about the things we really loved. The territories were unique. It gave guys 32 places to work, and then some, not even including the stuff in Europe or Japan.
And crucial to people who are just starting off in the business, because these smaller sized territories, like a Don Owens in Portland or a Jerry Jarrett in Tennessee, that's where the guys breaking in the business went to break in. And they would go there and they'd work 5-6 nights a week. Right. They weren't paid a lot of money, but they made $300 to $500 a week, which in the 70s was not that bad for a pro wrestler. You know,
people like Shawn Michaels of today actually did that. You know, drove in his car for 200 miles.
Started in Kansas City. Started for Bob Geigel in Kansas City.
Get your experience for a year, and then they would move up to a bigger promotion, not the big ones like WWF or San Francisco Roy Shaw. Just a little bit bigger promotion. And then you got to the marquee promotions, and that's how a wrestler learned. And you can learn your trade when you're doing 300 matches a year.
Kevin,
you can't learn it when you're an indie wrestler today doing 2 or 3 matches a month.
Just before I go to Kevin, or Kevin pipes up, I want to interrupt because that was the beauty of the territories, and that's what the wrestlers of that era still say, is you had to work 7, 8, 9, 10 years before they'd consider you a wrestler. You had the territories you could work. Here you had, 14 different cities or whatnot. So it was so important, and that's what we're lacking now. There's only, WWF only has like one place, and that's why it's a whole mess. Territories, you really get your time in front of people and in front of different crowds. It was so important, and that's a reason the business is as bad as it is now.
Like you said, Mike, having 28 or 30 territories in the country, every big wrestler was guaranteed a career, a lifetime career as a main event wrestler. Rocky Johnson, The Rock's father, was guaranteed 25 years of wrestling or more. Pat Patterson, Dean Ho, any of the wrestlers you want to name was guaranteed.
Well, the careers are not lasting as long today because of injuries, and the injuries are because of the steroids. And anybody that still thinks that the WWE has cleaned up their steroid problem, yes, they have with certain wrestlers, but there are a lot of wrestlers that they haven't because they need those wrestlers.
Yeah, and you need to be big. It's changed a bit, but you need to be pretty big to be a successful pro wrestler these days.
And the problem, too, is the style, a lot of that, because now you have, it's high spot city, very little psychology as we had in the territories, and you could have Johnny Valentine against, say, Killer Kowalski in Florida, and Valentine would crank on a headlock and sit there and work the crowd wisely with just a headlock, them laying down there. It wasn't a rest hold. It was, smart. And you made the best use, the most efficient use. You didn't have, like Harley Race's suplex, which should be a finisher in all cases, or a figure four, no matter who's doing it, Powers or Flair, should not be a transition move. Now that's all it is. And guys are getting hurt because, it's all just a collection of high spots.
Do you have what it takes to become a pro wrestler? The APW Boot Camp Training School is accepting applicants for pro wrestlers, managers, valets, and referees. All Pro Wrestling home APW Boot Camp is where future legends are born. For the last 19 years, APW has been the leader in talent development. Top graduates include the Great Khali, Crash Holly, Spike Dudley, and Alyssa Flash. For your free brochure, call us at 510-785-8396.
One of the benefits of coming through the territories, the amount of seasoning and experience you would get, but also we talk about some of these all-time greats based on what has to be considered the bizarre restrictions of talent for WWE now, which is, the show, that if you're not over 6'2" or 6'3", they won't even look at you. And based on that criteria, there would never have been a Ric Flair, a Shawn Michaels, an Eddie Guerrero, a Dean Malenko, and the list can go on forever.
And I think really the small guys helped pick up the business. When I wanted to be a pro wrestler in 1974, I had no shot because I was soaking wet 170 with no muscularity. Today, the 170 is acceptable. No, they're not making the good money. The big guys are, like Kevin's alluding to right now. If you're Rey Mysterio Jr., you're making maybe $800,000 a year. That's nothing to sneeze at. But the big guys, 270, 275 and up. Batista, I think one of his last years, $1.8 million. Those are good numbers.
That's a crime. The territories, there were actually, here we get back to, I think there were obviously more positives, is what I'm going to at least be saying, and I hope you guys will agree, to the territories versus now, the indies, in that there was just such a level of uniqueness. There were smaller, I wouldn't say we'd call them small man territories, but say Leroy McGurk, who focused on the World Junior Heavyweight Championship, he had a plethora of guys that were so fantastic and quick. Danny Hodge, Hiro Matsuda, Irish Pat Barrett, etc. And Roy Shire's territory was never known as just known as a talented craftsmanship territory. But we always looked at a big guy territory. Whatever the reason, Vince Sr. and Vince Jr. always would go for the tallest, biggest guys they could find, whether it was a Killer Khan or a Blackjack
Almost
Mulligan.
like the midgets and the females, the small guys didn't exist a lot. And I think McGurk pushed Danny Hodge, and he was considered a little guy, but he was talented. That guy could wrestle. Even today, I was there at Cauliflower Alley when a couple of the drunk big guy wrestlers wouldn't settle down, and they said something snide to Danny Hodge. Danny Hodge was ready to take him on right then and there. He's in his 70s.
Wow.
Amazing.
Now, what do you guys think about our next topic is the death of the territories. Territories were a thriving business where hundreds of people made a living, entertained thousands of people weekly all over the country, from everyone from commentators, talent, referees, photographers, writers. There was a whole infrastructure and system. Then all of a sudden, it was gone.
Well,
cable television and then the national. Those are the two things that killed the territories.
And for example, here in the West Coast, Roy Shire's promotion, I believe it was January after the Battle Royal, January of '82, I believe.
Right.
But the funny thing, looking back at that, we saw the crowds diminish a little bit, yes. I remember distinctly looking out at the crowd at one of Roy's last cards. The Battle Royal still sold out, the last one, but I believe it was in November, December, and we were complaining because there were only, and the Chronicle said, a crowd of only 6,800. Now, when you look back, we were used to 12,000, 15,000. 6,800 is nothing to really laugh at.
That was due to the decline of regional wrestling,
Yeah.
I believe.
But we were so spoiled with huge crowds for years. Sacramento Auditorium, at least 3,000 every other Wednesday night. And like Roland says, TV did have a lot to do with it, yes.
Booker Pat Patterson went to AWA, and they lost their booker. Roy Shires went and got Bob Roop out of Florida. Mm-hmm. He became the booker. Mm-hmm. The product was just as good, but it didn't draw as well as Patterson's product. Mm-hmm. I think that just has more to do with the era and the expansion of cable television. There was a lot of stuff that came into play for the downfall of the crowds.
There was other factors too, besides the Superstation. When we first started getting it on our cable systems, 76, 77. Oh, gee, you wanted to see Tommy Rich and Wahoo and Ole and Ivan Koloff, etc. My home base territory, even though I flew around and shot everywhere, in L.A., Mike LaBelle started pulling the purse strings and getting cheaper and cheaper. And he would get some of Vince Sr.'s cast-offs, his TV enhancement talent, like an S.D. Jones, or Bobby Cash and bring them in and immediately put belts on them.
Thinking that they could increase the bottom line by decreasing the payroll, but it didn't work. It just got worse.
It killed it. And then also Mike LaBelle was, I guess, trying to be forward-thinking. He was the first to bring in Moskowitz before Moskowitz worked for Bosch and Fritz von Erich in Texas. And he was employing more and more and more Hispanic wrestlers and getting rid of that base of Blassie and Tolis and Ernie Ladd and the Sheik. And when he closed, I mean, he was moving and closing some of the smaller clubs, sadly, and then moving, he was out of the Olympic Auditorium, which he didn't own, and it was almost a full Hispanic card, and we didn't appreciate it at the time. I'd already moved up here and was working as Roy's photographer, but I see Perro Aguayo, Fishman, the Brazos, and I'm going, this is terrible. Now, I would have marked out for that kind of thing because all those guys were legends. But then, I was raised on Blassie, Tolis, Sheik, Ernie Ladd, Shibuya, and Saito.
Ernie Ladd was a smart man. That guy made a lot of money in the wrestling business because he treated himself like he were either Andre the Giant, the midgets, the women, or Victor the Bear.
A touring attraction.
He became a drawing card, and he wouldn't do the territory for a long time. He was on the road all the time.
In the main events only, state to state, country to country. Ernie the Big Cat Ladd. Yeah, and he worked for Shire, of course.
He'd work a program with you. He'd do TV and he'd do your big show, but he wouldn't work in the small towns because he had too many other big shows he had to do.
Yeah, why do a small one if you have a big one on tap?
And the same things were like Andre the Giant, one of the greatest in our history. Andre always was constant demand all over the country, all over the world, literally, but really all over the country. Andre was booked constantly. So he would fly from big city to big city, big payoffs. Haystack Calhoun.
Well, before him, Haystack sort of set the precedent, whereas the women and the midgets started it. Then Haystack was a touring attraction. He would go from territory to territory. Andre followed. Now, the Vachons had sent, and I just talked to Paul Vachon last week, once Andre had Jean Ferret in that character. Once they'd finessed him, they brought him over from Europe and then took him on some Japanese tours with Carpentier and Karl Gotch. They bring him into Montreal. He does the Jean Ferret. And once he was seasoned enough, Vince Sr. made the offer, and basically it was like Paul and Maurice sold his contract to Vince Sr., who then wisely booked him to all the territories.
I was just about to say that. What a lot of the wrestling fans don't know is that, like someone like Andre, Vince Sr. jumped on him and got him under contract and started having him,
contracting him out,
booking him out.
Right.
booking just the big shows, and that's all. And they were making good money. They were taking a percentage, and the percentage sometimes in wrestling was never the right 15% that agents normally collect. So sometimes it could be 40, 50%.
But that's the negative. So Kevin's probably going to go into some of the very few negatives of the territories. Is maybe the pay thing, but the Andre thing too. Before I forget that, was when he would come in, it would be, at least for our territory, when the NWA champion would come in, or Andre, they'd raise the ticket prices, whereas they normally be $3.50 kids, $5 adults in L.A., they would jump to $7.50, and $5 when Andre.
They do that, Alan? I don't remember.
Did they do
the last Cow Palace, Roy's last Battle Royal, was $10.
Look at the phenomenal amount of talent. Pat won that last one, as he should have. You had both Funks, Harley. You had 5 world champions on that last card.
Great talent.
Former
and sold it out, of course, even with the territory, quote, slowly sort of dying down a little bit.
Now, keep in mind, not all the territories died with national wrestling. There was a couple of them that were pretty stubborn, like, Lawler and Jarrett. When you're doing 11.3 ratings every week on television and you're still drawing decent, house, Vince didn't like that, but he couldn't get them to fold,
He screwed over Stampede, but he couldn't
and
shut
Don Owen
down.
was the same
Don
way.
Owen and Memphis.